Hey fellow fishing fanatics, learning how to fish a pond is very different than learning to fish a lake. So you can take some of those tips that you've learned in other videos, but generally speaking, a pond just fishes way differently. Lucky for you, I've fished ponds my entire life. So I've picked up several tips the hard way, learning them myself, and of course, picking them up from friends and family who's fished with me. So the most important thing to remember, knowing when to go, what gear you need to bring along, and how to actually break the pond down will give you the best opportunity to catch more bass all year round. So let's get started. My name is Wesley Littlefield with anglers.com, and like I said, I grew up bass fishing ponds. I have 2 ponds on my property, and then I had friends that had ponds, so we were just always fishing, whether we were at each other's houses or whatever. I was just always had a fishing pole in my hand at a pond. Now, I've learned several things, either from fishing with friends, fishing with my dad, or just learning the hard way here on the water. I think these tips can apply to across the country, and they're gonna make you a better angler. So if any of this content helps you in any way, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe. That really helps me, and you'll be recommended more videos like this one on pond fishing and just bass fishing in general. So if you like it, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Otherwise, let's get to the content. So determining when you're gonna go is obviously the most important. Now for bass fishing in a pond, usually like early spring and early summer are the best times to go. And that's when most people tend to visit the pond. So whether you're fishing in your local neighborhood pond and it's packed, you might want to think about fishing some other time just to not compete with all these other people, all these other presentations. And that's why I actually like going fishing in the fall the most. Number one, the bass are just more active. The days are a little bit cooler, so if you're fishing in the summer, you're not sitting there sweating to death all the time, and there's just fewer people out on the water typically, so you don't have to work as hard or deal with a bunch of people while you're fishing. But determining when to go is gonna be your best route. I'm not gonna say that there is a best time to go because it really depends on so many factors, you know, weather conditions leading up to the day, but generally speaking, ponds are good fishing year round. Now, if they freeze, different story. Maybe you can go ice fishing, never done it. As far as where I'm from, what we do, I've fished ponds just year round because bass are more confined, so they're easier to find. You can just get a bite on, you know, fewer casts or fewer presentations. So knowing when to go, best time wise, I wouldn't go fishing at a pond in a lightning storm or in a snowstorm or anything like that, or right after a cold front. Usually that, you know, you need a day or two to get the fish back going, warming back up, but there's not a terrible time to fish a pond besides those few that I just mentioned. Let's move on to the gear you need to fish a pond. This is probably like what everybody really wants to know, what everybody wants to focus on. And in my opinion, you really only need like 2 rods and a small tackle box. The first thing I would recommend is learning how to cast a bait caster and using a bait caster. For bass fishing, they cast farther, they are easier to fight a fish with, they're just better most of the time and for most presentations. With that said, I think you also need a spinning reel for those other presentations when you're just gonna have to slow way down, or like a drop shot, or you know, some lighter, smaller lures. You're gonna need a spinning reel, rod and reel too. And as far as your tackle box goes, we're gonna talk about lures a little bit later, but you don't need that many. Generally, you know, your basic lures are going to work, and you don't have to have such a wide variety of colors either. That's why I honestly prefer to fish in ponds, is because the fish don't have as many options, so they're usually not as picky. Now you also might want like a backpack to carry everything. If you've got to walk to the pond, that's a great thing to have, is like a little fishing backpack or something. You know, some people have the carts and trolleys that they carry, whatever you want there. But for me, I typically just have 2 rods and a small tackle box to cycle through a few lures and a few presentations and go from there. All right, let's get to the really important stuff, actually breaking down a pond. Now, what I'm gonna do for this segment is actually walk around this pond, casting, showing you what I'm thinking and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then hopefully we're gonna catch some fish so I can show you that, hey, this is what actually works. Okay, so I'm typically will start in a corner for 2 reasons. Number one, the bass just like corners. It's easy where they can literally corner their food and not have to chase it very far. So corners are some of the best places to start. And typically, it's also where the cover kind of congregates, whether it's been blown, you know, like a grass mat that gets blown along the edge and it gets stuck in the corner, or you know, you've got an old dead tree falling down. Typically it's in a corner. I'm looking for cover, I'm looking for structure. So as you can see behind me, there's what was an old dock. They're metal posts, so there's gonna be bass around that, hugging close to that structure. I've actually done a lot of work to this pond, so I know that there's actually brush piles in here and there's a few rock piles and different stuff. So I know what I'm going to expect, but that's also goes to my point of knowing your pond. So doing a little bit of research behind it can help you, you know, even if you just know, hey, you know, I had a buddy who said there's a brush pile over there in this corner. That's a great place to start. So I'm gonna start in this corner, make a few casts, and see if we can't get a bite. Now, what I like to use for a search bait, and what I mean by search bait is I want a moving bait that the bass are likely gonna bite. In a pond, I like using a Mepps or a rooster tail or something like that. You know, a small spinner bait like a Booyah Pond Magic are excellent search baits, because right now I just want to catch a bass. I don't worry about if it's a giant bass or anything like that. So I'm gonna throw this around, see if we can't get a bite. And if we don't, we're gonna move. I'll explain why we move. So my approach to a corner is this. I'm gonna make a few casts running down one bank, and then I'm gonna turn and make a few casts running down the other bank. And I'm gonna start shallow and work my way deep, or this time of year, I might need to start deep and work myself shallow. For a pond, it really doesn't matter. I would recommend that if you're gonna start shallow, typically it's gonna be like a warmer day. So if the water, you know, is warming up, the bass are gonna be moving shallow because that shallow water is gonna warm faster. So I would start shallow on a, you know, a warmer day or when the water's warming up. But if it's cold or you just had a cold front or whatever, you might start deeper and then work shallow. All right, let's cast down this side of the bank and see if we can't get a bite. All right, so pretty quickly with a few casts, I've determined that the bass just probably aren't shallow today. Number one, it's like 35, 40 degrees, so they're probably gonna be a little bit deeper. And we just had a cold front come through yesterday, day before. So I'm thinking we're gonna have to go a little bit deeper, but I'm still gonna use this same lure just because, number one, I really like them. They work great in ponds. And number two, I still wanna cover water till I find some fish. So I've walked around the pond a little bit, and there's this point that I'm gonna try and fish a little bit because number one, points are just another good place. Bass can come up from deep, push their bait, shallow feed, and then quickly get back to deeper water. And I also know that there is a good level change here. It goes from shallow to deep pretty quickly. So more than likely there's gonna be fish hanging around it, but we're about to find out. Now it's important to remember to adjust your reel speed when you're trying to find where the fish are actually hanging out. So I'm not reeling the same speed every cast. You know, I'll make a couple casts in one spot, reel in one speed, make sure, you know, if that's what they want, great. If not, I'll make another cast and change my reel speed up, my presentation up just a little bit to see maybe if that's what they want. I always do this before switching baits. That way I'm not switching back and forth all the time. You know, I'm spending more time fishing, trying to figure out what they want, and less time switching, tying on baits. All right, so I've cast this bunch, tried to make, you know, different presentations, moved areas, and I'm not getting bites. So we're gonna go tie on something a little bit different, see if I can't, you know, get a bite that way. So I think the main reason why this isn't working, number one, it's like dead calm right now. And this little spinner, it tends to work better when there's a little bit of ripple, when there's a little bit of wind. So if you're fishing dead calm, spinner baits, little spinners like this, typically aren't the bait to go for, but I just like throwing them, so I was gonna test it out. We're gonna switch to something just a little bit different. I'm actually gonna throw a chatterbait without the skirt. I just put on a paddle tail. So the reason I switched to that is because I can actually fish it a lot slower than what I was fishing that little rooster tail, and I can still fish it a little bit slower than a crankbait. So let's see if we can't get a bite now. Now, because I wasn't getting a bite with it moving so fast, I am gonna start fishing the chatterbait a little bit slower. You know, still moving it pretty consistently, but you know, I can let it sit there for a second instead of just straight reeling it back. So I'm not gonna be able to cover as much water, but this isn't a very big pond either, so that part of it doesn't matter so much. But I think that it'll help me be able to slow down and really break down the area. Now I just made that cast, and when I cast, I noticed that there was fry, small little minnows, jumping up out of the water. So I'm gonna keep that in mind because the wind is starting to pick up just a little bit and kind of blow that direction. So with the wind picking up, it will start blowing the small fish, the plankton, everything to that side of the pond. So that's something I'm gonna keep in mind as I continue to break down this pond. So I switched to a weightless Texas rig Senko. We're gonna see if this works a little bit. I can still cover a little bit of water once again, but I can keep it slow. They just don't seem to be wanting big vibrating and obnoxious lures right now for some reason. The water's really dirty, but it's also cold, so that could be it. But let's go see if we can't catch one. Well, I fished and fished my butt off and never got so much as just a little bitty bump. So I'm gonna call it a day, but good thing for you, I'm actually gonna leave some fish catches out of this very pond to show you and prove to you that I know what I'm talking about. They'll be shortly after this little clip. And I promised that I would give you some of my favorite pond lures, and they are a chatterbait, a jig, a Texas rig, a wacky rig, and I really like throwing a crankbait, but I like throwing crankbaits all the time anyways. Now, if you want to see me dive deep into these lures, explaining why they work a little bit better in ponds, I've actually got a video down below me that is absolutely worth checking out. Until then, I want you to always remember that education is important, but fishing is essential.